The CR-4 was a diesel hydraulic locomotive offered by the Plymouth Locomotive Works during the 1960s. This two-axle industrial switcher was part of the CR line, which also included the three-axle CR-6 and the much larger four-axle CR-8. Built in very limited quantities, like many such locomotives, only one CR-4 survives on the Walkersville Southern Railroad, which also owns an EMD Model 40. This was a prototype that I originally wanted to build with the small spike motors. The motor and battery box looked like they would fit perfectly under the CR-4's dual hoods. Unfortunately, I initially could not figure out how to power both axles, since 12-tooth bevel gears can't form a three-way connection. I didn't think about it too much and moved on to other options, eventually building the GMDH1. Shortly after I posted my video on the GMD, I had an epiphany. I could turn the motor around and avoid the three-way problem altogether. This would involve some suspect engineering, but I deemed that acceptable as the drivetrain would not have to handle a lot of torque due to the model's low weight and the motor's low power. The final design measures 24 by 10 studs, and it uses about 400 parts and weighs about 300 grams. Since the electronics take up so much of the internal volume, the body has very few studs holding it together. While this makes it fairly fiddly to assemble, the completed build becomes less fragile because much of the shell presses against rigid internal components like the battery box itself. Furthermore, the very sturdy chassis, built around two 1x16 Technic beams plated together, gives a good place to pick up the loco. Some of the axles in the drivetrain go through these small hubs, which attach to the Technic frame with just half a stud of axle. That is not the sketchy part. That would be the motor mount, which uses plates and pins to support the wrong side of the motor. This assembly would easily come apart under even moderately heavy load, but the CR-4 can only pull about 100 grams, and it will slip long before the drivetrain breaks. With its 1-to-1 gearing, the model is slow. Nominally, it should run just as fast or just as slow as the GMDH1, but having just one motor makes it significantly weaker, and it does not run nearly as smoothly at lower speeds. In general, these motors themselves don't seem to run that smoothly, and one of our two motors surges noticeably more than the other. This might explain some of the asymmetric behavior displayed by our spike logo turtle. Like in the GMDH1, a side panel has to come off to access the power button. Despite the single stud connection, this still takes a bit of wiggling. The motor cable also needs a ton of folding to fit inside the shell. Furthermore, I had to make the motor and battery an integral part of the model's structure. The roof and hood attach directly, and they cannot support themselves without the electronics in place. Though powered up parts cost so much, I am starting to prefer using them now that I have all this PU equipment. At first, I liked just not needing a receiver, but now I appreciate the flexibility in control as well. The Powered Up app could already do some neat things like gradual acceleration, but Pybricks takes this to another level and does not need to run on a device either. More on alternative control schemes in a future video. But after all that, is the CR-4 actually smaller than the Model 40? That isn't entirely clear. The latter is shorter in length, but the former is shorter in height. And this makes sense because the battery box sits vertically in the Model 40. I'd say the CR-4 has slightly less volume overall, but I would call it close either way. On that note, this is the end of the video. Please consider subscribing if you like what we do, and have a nice day.